Good afternoon, everybody. Good to be back in Trinidad. It's quickly become one of my favorite places to visit. And what I'm talking about today really, I think, comes on the heels of some comments that Margaret made this morning about what is our role in public governance. And obviously, there are a number of roles that I think are played, but what I think is often overlooked is what I believe the vital role of information security. And I think that it's something that everybody in public government should take on as their responsibility as well. Just as a show of hands, how many folks are involved in the public procurement process itself? Okay, so roughly half or so. And of you that are involved with that, how many of you assume a role in a formal way of protecting information security? Okay, not as many, and I'm not surprised to see that. What I will hopefully impart to you today is the absolute need for everyone, especially in the public procurement space, to be involved with the information security process. It's not uncommon to find that most folks assign that role exclusively to the IT department or the security department and assume it's their responsibility to assume the role not only internally within the public agency, but also dealing with suppliers or tenderers. And I find that divergence is one of the main reasons why we see information security breaches. I'll ask this question as well. What do you think is the percentage likelihood that your suppliers, one or more, will cause an information security breach in your agency? Any guesses? 25%. Okay, anyone else? A little higher? 40%. The likelihood that there will be an information security breach as a result of your suppliers is 100%. Okay? It will happen. The impact it will have on your agency or on the government will depend, in my opinion, in large part on how well you are involved in the information security process. Okay? Information security breaches happen all the time. In most cases, we're not even aware of them. It's when we obviously see the high-profile ones. By the time it reaches that level, it's because there was a significant breakdown somewhere in the chain. And oftentimes, it may be due to the public procurement process. And so what I'm going to do today is I want to go through some of the nuts and bolts, and I'm going to keep this as informal as I can, because I know that not all of us are information security experts, and you don't need to be. But I think it's important to have a good working knowledge of how a lot of this works so that when you are involved in the process, you understand some of those key points to address and things to think about to mitigate that risk. So what is information security involved? What are we really talking about here? I have a definition up here, and it's really about reducing the risk of loss in three areas. The first is confidentiality, and obviously when we talk about confidentiality, we're talking about what is the risk in the event that there is a loss of, or there is an inadvertent disclosure of certain information or secure data. Integrity, what is the impact if there is a loss of confidence or trustworthiness in the particular asset? Okay? And availability, what is the risk if we can't get to that information when we need to? So the information security program involves, there's two major elements, risk analysis and risk management. And risk analysis is, number one, taking an inventory of all of our information systems, which may seem like an easy task potentially. But I often find that most organizations don't have a good centralized database where you can easily see what all of your systems are. Okay? And what's the value to the organization and the degree to which the organization is exposed to risk. Okay? That determination is also part of this first element of risk analysis. Okay? The second piece is risk management. Once we've done the risk analysis, what do we do to effectively manage that risk? And the first is selecting the controls and the security measures that reduce the exposure to risk. Okay? I find that this last piece is probably the most challenging. And you'll see that as we go through this, we can't start to talk about how we involve information security in the public procurement process when dealing with third parties unless we understand what our own internal information security program is. Okay? If we don't have that, we have nothing to give to the third party supplier, right? So we want to be able to select the controls, the measures, those particular elements of a plan that reduce our overall organization's exposure to risk. And it needs to be done within a framework where those measures are complemented by computer, administrative, personnel, and physical security measures. Okay? Usually when you see an information security breach, it's at that level one of these things breaks down. Okay? Anyone want to venture a guess as to which one of those security measures is the largest and most common reason for the breakdown? Personnel. Okay? Human failure is by far the #1 reason. Okay? And as we'll talk about as we get into the program today, the crucial importance of having awareness training for personnel, understanding what everyone's role is and how we can avoid those human errors to create significant information security breaches. Okay, so obviously taking that program that we've developed within our agency and now embedding that into our public procurement process is obviously not an easy task. Okay, it's difficult enough to have the program work internally versus now actually having the third party tender be subject to it as well. So the first step is when we talked about the two elements of our information security, the risk analysis or risk assessment on the products or services that the tender is going to be offering. Okay? And what is the impact on the public agency's sensitive information? Depending upon what that product or service is and what element of the agency, we're going to have very, very different analyses. Okay? What type of data is involved? Okay? What type of data is the third party going to be exposed to? Okay? Is the agency an agency that is of extreme critical importance, or is it a lesser importance? And the amount of resources and time we want to devote is going to depend upon how that analysis ultimately shakes out, right? And so once we've gone through that process, we want to apply that into the actual contract, okay? For those of you that are in public procurement, I'm going to assume that most of you deal with standard terms and conditions that you will apply to the tender, okay? Again, show of hands, if you could let me know how many of you are aware of, within that contractual framework, particular information security requirements that are built into that contract? Okay. Either, maybe you're not aware, or maybe you're not sure if they're there, or maybe they're just not there. Either way, that's something that I think is of critical importance that we do become aware of. So when we are in that process of negotiating with the supplier, if the terms are there, but we have no way of effectively explaining those or ensuring that the procurer, or rather the supplier, can abide by those, that's where we start to see the breakdown. That's where we start to see the breaches. Okay? Even though we may have contractual terms in place, if we don't have the processes in place to ensure that they're actually being met, the terms mean effectively nothing. So I laid out these following elements, what I think are a good start to effectively adopting the information security program to the third-party supplier. Okay, so the first one obviously is we need to define what those requirements are internally for the agency. Okay, and this usually I find is generally a function of the IT folks or the security people to start to do that, to start to understand what it means to have a security program agency-wide. Okay, and figuring out in what areas is there more critical importance or sensitivity than others. Okay, the second is determining the agency level risk to the mission or business case. So if we're talking about a contract for the Department of Dog Catchers, right? Obviously, we're talking about a much lower level of risk and security than if we're dealing with a military or some sort of intelligence agency, right? So that has to be bridged. We have to figure out what is that ultimate agency level risk, how much time and resource do we need to devote to that mission or business case depending upon that risk, okay? Provide a standard basis to develop, implement, and measure the effective information security management practices for tenderers. It's not enough to have the plan built at the onset. One of the key elements is ongoing tracking to ensure that the supplier is actually complying with the terms that we've set forth. It never really stops. As long as that process continues with the supplier, so goes the obligation to ensure that the information security practices are being met. So once they've been developed, once they've been implemented, how well do we measure those things? What are we doing with the supplier to ensure that as time goes on, the supplier is doing what it's supposed to with respect to information security? Are we keeping logs? Are we conducting audits? What are we doing? Are we just assuming that it's getting done correctly and hope for the best? Okay. I know that it's not uncommon for folks in procurement, once the contract is signed, it's put into a drawer and we forget about it. It's someone else's problem, okay? What I will suggest to you is that your job also involves ensuring that those things are continually met. And if it's not something that you do exclusively, something where the contract has to stay out of the drawer and those service levels or those different measuring sticks that we have in there have to be maintained. And this is one of those things that I would suggest is something is an ongoing obligation because it's always someone else's job, right? And that's always a problem I find is that the security breaks down because everyone assumes, well, it was someone else's responsibility, okay? Defining standard information security approaches and definitions to enable confidence in the bidding process. If I'm a bidder, I want to know that there's some standard set of security practices that I need to meet. I want to know that it's not going to change every single time I place a bid or I'm looking to potentially bid on for a product or service. Okay? Again, establishing confidence in the process. Okay? Establishing integrity. And the next one is establishing information security classifications guidelines. Not every piece of information is going to have obviously the same set of security. Okay? The number of chairs that you have in the cafeteria obviously is going to have a different security classification than taxpayer information and the amount of taxes that, let's say, an individual pays. And you may have lots of different levels of classifications, everything from low, you could have private, sensitive, very sensitive, confidential, highly confidential, whatever. But it's up to the public agency to make the determination of where that data fits, okay? Because we can't devote all the time and resources that we have, because we obviously have a very limited amount, to all the data and all the information that we have. We can't. We need to identify which has higher levels of security classification, and those areas obviously need greater attention. Okay? So once we've established those, then we need to prescribe, well, how do we handle it? What procedures do we want to put in place to effectively handle that information, depending upon the security classification level? There may be personnel training involved. There may be greater password security that's required. There may be in locked rooms, locked drawers, whatever it happens to be, those guidelines need to be put in place against the security classification levels. Does that make sense? And the last one I have is describing the specific baseline procedures for handling the public body information assets. So ongoing, what are those ongoing procedures that we need to ensure are taking place in order to make sure that the classifications are being met, okay, with what we defined above, what the criteria is. Okay, so when we start talking about that, how do we start to integrate our standard public procurement processes with the security guidelines that we just described, okay? So I put together what I find is the typical life cycle of both an IT system and a procurement life cycle. And we're going to see how these things overlap, okay? In an IT system, first we have the initiation. We got to get started. What's the business case? What's the need? Okay, what are we looking to do? Second is development and acquisition. We start to go through the process of bringing that product or service in. We start to develop the information or the particular contract terms to do that. Third is implementation. We're actually going through, we're working with the vendor or supplier to actually bring the product or service in. The fourth is the ongoing operation and maintaining that product or service as time goes on. And finally, disposal. At some point, that relationship ends. What do we do with that product or service at the end of that relationship? And the procurement life cycle has some similarities. So the first is the mission and business planning again. What is the need? What is the plan to address that need? Acquisition planning, that's effectively the bidding process. What terms are we going to put out to bid in order to solicit the bids from the vendors? Third is the acquisition itself. Fourth is contract performance, much like we had above. And fifth, again, similar, we have the disposal and closeout. How do we end that relationship? Okay? And the line I put at the end here is just to underscore what I mentioned at the beginning, how especially important IT security is throughout this entire procurement life cycle. It doesn't end at number 3, right? From a public procurement standpoint, right? It has to continue on because information security is an ongoing obligation. So I kind of lined up how these things overlay, both the procurement life cycle and the IT system life cycle phases. Okay, and each one of these things is, again, IT security requirements have to be involved in each one of these steps. Okay, so phase 1 of the procurement life cycle is the needs determination, which defines the problem to be resolved through the procurement process. And we have the basic system idea, okay, what's the need that has to be fulfilled, and we start to put together the preliminary requirements, okay. And this may be something that isn't necessarily within your purview. Perhaps it's happening behind the scenes and it's not coming to your desk until these things have been defined, okay. But just to kind of give you an idea of the overall life cycle and how security relates, I think it's important to go through these. And obviously there's going to be some internal approval process that you have within your agency in order for these initial steps to move forward to the next step. So the way security works with that first phase, the considerations here, is there needs to be a preliminary system security plan that maps to that needs and those requirements that we've defined. How are we going to apply our information security procedures to that initial phase? Okay, what things do we need to build into the process from a security standpoint? Okay, so it's going to link the need itself to the performance objectives. What security objectives do we have? How do they need to be met? And if they can't be met, what are the alternatives? What are our fallback positions? Whether it's a different vendor, whether it's a different process, we want to list those alternatives out. This is where the preliminary sensitivity assessment should be involved as well. Remember, we talked about security classifications based upon the type of data that we have, whether it's, again, the number of chairs in the room, the color of the carpet that we have, or maybe it's taxpayer information. Again, we want to conduct that assessment now to determine what security classifications are involved. What's that assessment look like? Okay, and as I mentioned in the last one, I have here high, moderate, or low, but you get the idea. You can have lots of different levels of granularity here. Phase 2 is acquisition planning, and this is where there's more of a significant requirements analysis. And this is where we start to put together a statement of work or some other type of document that describes in more detail the exact services or products or requirements that we expect the supplier to provide. Okay, and I just throw here other activities in this phase. Oftentimes there's market research, there's the socioeconomic analysis that's done, but this is all part of the planning process when we're looking to acquire the product or service. And from a security perspective during this phase, again, we want to look at integrity, availability, and confidentiality. Those are the 3 keys, as I mentioned at the onset. Okay, how are those 3 things going to be impacted based upon the requirements, based upon the particular product or service that we're looking at? Usually, or I should say it's not uncommon at this stage to determine that the sensitivity assessment that we had conducted in phase 1 may have changed now. Okay, because now that we've got into the actual acquisition with the vendor, we've determined that the sensitivity may have changed a bit. So that assessment has to continually be updated. And I'll say that that's an assessment that is never really stops. I mean, that's a continuing ongoing process where we're always looking at where that sensitivity level is going to change, whether we've got different types of data, different access to the information that may change over time. Okay? The level of assurance analysis, how well is that particular vendor going to meet the security requirements that we've laid out? Okay? And depending upon that level of assurance, we have to conduct an assessment of the risk. Okay? How well is the vendor going to match those requirements? If the vendor can't, how are we going to address that risk? What's the preparation for that? Okay? What's our plan in the event that can't be met? Okay? And if there's an IT system or some other major application, we want a full-blown security plan at this stage. Okay? And again, although it may not be something that you as a public procurement professional is responsible for, it is something that I think you want to be involved with when you're dealing with the IT folks who are developing that plan. So you know, when you're negotiating with the supplier, how this is going to fit into the contractual terms. And it's ensuring that that plan makes its way into the process to ensure that ultimately the supplier is contractually bound by that plan. Okay? And as we'll talk about in a minute, in addition to making sure that those terms are actually built into the contract, we want to talk about how are we going to effectively ensure that the vendor is aware of specifically what those obligations are. Okay, in practice, how is that vendor going to comply with these obligations? Not uncommon to actually conduct visits on site to the supplier to take a look at exactly what they're doing. Let's look at your security measures. Let's look at your data center, if it's going to be somewhere where they're actually going to be holding information, electronic information or software or other types of data. What type of security cameras do you have? Do you ensure that every employee there has a key card to get in? Those are the types of things that really need to be addressed. And again, it's something that's oftentimes missed during this stage. So phase 3 is the acquisition itself. And here is where we're going to actually put together the solicitation. We're going to start to receive offers that come in. And we're going to consider, effectively the entirety of the request for quote or the solicitation offer to see how well those things are actually met by the supplier. Okay, so the statement of work, the source selection plan, how we're going to acquire the particular product or service, how we're going to evaluate it, test it, accept it, et cetera. Okay, and how the contract is going to be administered. Security-wise, again, this is where we're going to actually put the security requirements into the statement of work or into the contract. So that work that we've done now in the prior 2 phases now comes into play here, where we're going to build these in. Okay? The assignment of the contract security risk, we've done our risk assessment, we've done our security planning. Now we need to determine what level of risk are we looking at here. Okay? What type of resources are we going to require in order to ensure that the security classifications and requirements are met? Okay? The personnel security. Do we want everybody who's involved with the supplier to have access to the information that's at risk? Do we want to limit it only to specific personnel? Okay? Chances are the answer is yes. Okay? We don't want the janitor having access to taxpayer information just because he works for the supplier, right? So identifying what those security levels are within the supplier's organization is key here. Okay? We want to establish the security offer or the quotation evaluation, the acceptance criteria, and then conduct an evaluation of those offers or quotations based upon what we've laid out here above. And usually this is the spot or time in which we want to have the security folks themselves conduct their own review. Take a look at the solicitation that's come in, how well does it meet their expectations. And as I mentioned before, this is also where we want to ensure that there is awareness on the part of the contractor of what the security obligations are. Okay? And oftentimes, I always think it's a good idea to have certain training programs that are put in place for the suppliers so that they understand exactly what the contractual requirements are and what they have to do to meet them. In phase 4, this is actual contract performance. Okay? Everything's been signed, the product or service is being delivered. At this point, we want to have the ongoing monitoring of how well the supplier is doing what they're supposed to be doing. Okay? And here that may require the IT security expertise to assist in reviewing the contract performance. So if you have certain service levels that are built in the contract that suggest certain types of security that need to be met, this may be where you want to bring in, as a public procurement professional, the security folks to give you that determination. And if they're not being met, this is where it's our job to enforce any remedies or credits or other things that we have built into the contract to provide for those remedies in the event they're not being met. Okay? So inspecting the IT security deliverables, other things that are coming in from the product or service that we want to test against. And it may require some sort of modification to the contract if we find that it's not being done as initially planned. If we need to make amendments to the contract based upon what we're seeing, this oftentimes happens in phase 4. The way we overlay security in phase 4 is, again, when we inspect and look at deliverables and accept them, how well they're meeting the security obligations, the performance measures, and if we have those security requirements built in, this is where we want to conduct that type of an assessment. Maybe there's an audit that we have to do on site at the supplier's location to see whether they're being met. And the risk assessment may change. As I mentioned before, the risk assessment is something that is a living, growing consideration throughout the entire life cycle, okay, and that might need to be updated. And I throw in here, my opinion is that the procurement professional should be involved with these things. Okay, again, not in the drawer, should be involved because this may be something that we need to continually update or potentially even modify the agreement to reflect what we're finding here. And phase 5 is when we're talking about the end of the relationship, okay? And here, there may be different obligations that we have regarding what happens to the product or service when we're done. If it's something physical, do we dispose of it, and how do we dispose of it? Do we need to deal with the vendor? Does the vendor take the product back? If it's software, do we delete it? Does the vendor take it in some way? If it's something physical, is it something that we can sell or exchange or perhaps even donate? Again, all these things should be built into the contract to define what happens at the end of the relationship, because as we know, either we have a fixed term in the contract where we know there's going to be an end to the relationship, or if there isn't, at some point, we're moving on, right? There's going to be some sort of a process or some sort of a transition to maybe a new product or a new vendor, and we need to figure out how we're going to deal with the existing product or service. From a security standpoint, this is really where we get into a lessons learned. Okay, what have we learned about the particular security considerations with this product or service or this vendor? And that security plan that we've developed before, chances are we need to update it to take into account either things that have gone wrong, changes in technology, changes in law, whatever it is. This is where it's a good opportunity to update those security considerations. Okay? Archiving of information. So just because the product or service now is no longer being delivered, in most cases we're going to need to take the information that's been developed and archive it in a way where we can continually access it in the future. And we need to take into account changing the technologies in a way where we know we're archiving it in a way that regardless of the change in technologies, we can continue to access it. Sanitizing media, there are lots of different technologies involved with actually deleting information. It's more than just hitting delete on the keyboard. There's a lot of technologies involved or available where the media can actually be sanitized so information that is sensitive can't be obtained by an unauthorized third party. And as I mentioned before, how do we dispose of hardware or software? One thing to keep in mind is if we're dealing with, say, a cloud service provider, we don't physically have the assets, so we have to look to the provider in the cloud to actually remove this information. And those things should be built into the contract to identify how the cloud provider is going to do that. Okay, because oftentimes they're going to have information not only in one system, but a backup system somewhere else. And it could be in lots of different locations. How are we ensuring that all that information is going to be disposed of properly? Okay, so I want to take a few minutes and go through some case studies. Before I do, any questions at this point? Yes?